It's easy to admire a man when he's wearing a Rolex. The glint of gold, the weight of heritage, the quiet power on his wrist. It speaks volumes. But what if I told you the man behind that watch didn't start with wealth, fame, or even a family? What if I told you that the most iconic name in luxury timepieces was born not in comfort, but in chaos? That Rolex, the gold standard of watches, was shaped by a 12-year-old orphan who had nothing but grit, grief, and an almost irrational obsession with perfection. This is the untold story of Hans Wilsdorf, and it doesn't start in a boardroom. It starts in heartbreak. March 22, 1881, a quiet little town in Kulmbach, Germany. Hans Eberhard Wilsdorf was born to parents Johann Daniel and Anna Wilsdorf. They weren't royalty. They weren't tycoons. They were middle-class business owners running a hardware trade passed down from Hans's grandfather. A respectable life, stable, disciplined, structured. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. That structure wouldn't last long. By the time Hans was just 11 years old, his mother died. And if that grief wasn't enough to shatter a child, fate had worse plans. Within a year, his father too passed away, gone, just like that. At age 12, Hans Wilsdorf became an orphan. Think about that. No parents, no warmth, no real sense of direction, only questions and silence. He and his siblings were taken in by their uncles, men more concerned with logistics than love. The first thing they did? Sell off the family business. Gone was the legacy, the routine, the familiarity. The Wilsdorf children were sent to boarding school. Ernestinum Coburg in Bavaria. Sounds prestigious, but for Hans, it was prison. He hated it. The cold dormitories, the strange faces, the sense of being different. He didn't belong. A Protestant kid seen as other among his Catholic peers, ridiculed for his beliefs, dismissed for his grief, and thrown into an environment where nothing felt safe. But this is where the fire started. When the world ignores you, you have two choices: disappear or evolve. Hans chose to evolve. He buried himself in books. If people didn't want to listen to him, he'd make sure history did. He became obsessed with languages, mastered English and French. Why? Because somewhere deep inside, he believed he would leave Germany one day and build something global. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to dominate. And strangely enough, this school he hated gave him the first building blocks. Not emotionally, not creatively, but intellectually. He learned precision, attention to detail, how to spot errors in language, and eventually, how to spot them in mechanics. While his classmates were mocking his isolation, Hans was quietly sharpening the tools of a future icon. Around this time, something else happened. A Swiss boy at school befriended Hans. He wasn't just a friend, he was a window into a whole new world. This boy came from a place called La Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland, a town known for its rich history and watchmaking. And every time he talked about it, Hans listened with growing fascination. Stories of tiny mechanisms, craftsmen with microscopes and tweezers, the delicate dance of gears and springs. It wasn't just engineering, it was art. And for Hans, it was love at first listen. He didn't realize it yet, but this was the first time something had captured his heart fully since the death of his parents. Watchmaking, the meticulous nature of it, the way it merged math, patience, creativity, and control. In a world where he had lost everything, the idea of controlling time itself felt like salvation. At 19, Hans couldn't take it anymore. He wanted out of Germany, out of boarding school, out of the identity people kept forcing on him. So he packed up and left for Geneva, Switzerland, the land of the very craft he had grown obsessed with. His first job? Not in watches. Ironically, it was in pearls. He joined a pearl export firm, buying, grading, and sorting pearls for sale to jewelers. You'd think this would bore him, but it didn't. It taught him something invaluable. You don't need to manufacture something to profit from it. The company made big money without producing anything. They moved products efficiently, presented them well, and marketed them brilliantly. Hans was watching, learning, absorbing, but his real opportunity came 2 years later, in 1900. He received a letter from a friend, inviting him to join a company in, yes, La Chaux-de-Fonds, the town he'd heard about back in school, the mecca of watchmaking. The company? Kuno Korten. They weren't just any firm. They were one of the largest exporters of high-end pocket watches in Europe, moving nearly 1 million francs worth every year. This was Hans's golden ticket. He joined them as an English correspondent and clerk. Why English? Because years ago, he had painfully taught himself the language while everyone else in school mocked him. Now it was opening doors. He wrote letters, translated documents, dealt with international clients, and wound watches, hundreds of them, every day. Every single tick and tock passed through his hands. This was no ordinary job. This was his lab, his dojo. He didn't just work, he dissected. He studied the internal architecture of each piece, watched how even a tiny imbalance could throw everything off. He asked questions. Why does this spring work better than that one? Why does this watch gain 2 seconds while that loses one? He was obsessed. And while most of his colleagues were focused on their paychecks, Hans was focused on mastery. But just as he was hitting his stride, Germany called him back. Military service. It was mandatory. He left La Chaux-de-Fonds reluctantly and served in the army. And for 2 long years his passion sat dormant, but not extinguished. By 1903, now 22 years old, Hans had a new plan. He moved to London. Why London? Because it was the epicenter of international trade, the heart of the British Empire, and most importantly, it had a booming watch market. He joined a company specializing in luxury watch distribution and took on a much larger role. His job wasn't just translation or support anymore. He was now driving sales, and he was good at it, really good. He began forming relationships with jewelers across the UK, learned the business inside out, what sold, what didn't, what features customers loved, what design elements made them hesitate, which Swiss suppliers were reliable, which were slow. For Hans, this was the MBA he never got, real-world education. And once again, he wasn't just doing a job. He was collecting data, stacking knowledge, preparing. Around this time, something else entered his life. Love. He met Florence Frances May Crotty. They got married soon after. But Florence wasn't just his wife. She became his emotional anchor, the support system he never had growing up, the person who saw his vision and said, "Go for it." And so, he did. One evening, Hans sat with his brother-in-law Alfred James Davis, an older, wealthier man with a practical mind. They talked about life, business, and Hans's dream. Hans said something bold. "I think I'm ready to start my own watch company." Most people would have laughed, but Alfred didn't. He looked at this young, driven German with fire in his eyes and made a decision that would quietly change the world. He agreed to invest. In 1905, Hans Wilsdorf and Alfred Davis formed a new company, Wilsdorf and Davis Limited. And though the world didn't know it yet, this modest partnership would one day give birth to Rolex. But first, they had to build something from nothing. No factories, no famous name, no prestige, just passion and a vision to make the most precise, reliable, and elegant wristwatches the world had ever seen. The race had begun. The rise of a visionary. London, 1905. The city was alive, smoke curling from chimneys, typewriters clicking in offices, carriages rattling down cobblestone roads. In a small, unassuming office tucked into the city's fabric, a revolution was quietly brewing. Not political, not economic, but mechanical. Hans Wilsdorf, still in his 20s, had just co-founded Wilsdorf and Davis Limited, and his dream was singular: create the world's most precise wristwatch. The challenge? At that time, wristwatches were considered women's jewelry, delicate, decorative, and wildly inaccurate. Real men wore pocket watches. They were bulkier, precise, protected by fobs and chains, and considered a symbol of masculinity and status. Wristwatches were laughed at. They were seen as flimsy, feminine, unreliable, but Hans didn't care. In fact, he saw that as an opportunity. He believed the world was about to change. Faster transportation, faster communication, faster lifestyles. In this new world, people didn't want to dig into their pockets to tell time. They wanted it on their wrist. Easy, visible, accessible. But for that to work, the wristwatch had to earn respect. And to earn respect, it had to be precise, reliable, revolutionary. Hans needed 2 things to make this happen: movements and casing. So what did he do? He partnered with the Swiss watchmaking firm Egler, based in Biel/Bienne, Switzerland. Why them? Because they were one of the very few manufacturers producing small, high-quality movements precise enough to fit inside a wristwatch. And that partnership would change the history of horology forever. Wilsdorf and Davis imported these movements into England and placed them into elegant handmade watch cases. Then they branded them and sold them to jewelers. But Hans wasn't satisfied. He didn't want to just sell watches. He wanted to create a brand. He wanted a name that would one day be as iconic as Coca-Cola, as universal as OK, and as prestigious as a royal seal. It had to be short, easy to pronounce in every language, and elegant enough to fit perfectly on a tiny watch dial. He tried hundreds of combinations, literally. He scribbled down 5-letter words. He shuffled alphabets. He said names out loud until they lost meaning. And then it came to him. Rolex. Nobody knows for sure what it means. Some say it was derived from horlogerie exquise, French for exquisite watchmaking. Others believe it was pure instinct, but Hans was sure. Rolex sounded luxurious. It looked balanced. It felt global. And just like that, Wilsdorf and Davis Lantide became Rolex. That was 1908, a year that would change everything. Rolex watches started gaining a reputation not just for design but for performance. They were stylish, yes, but they were also accurate. In 1910, a Rolex watch received the Swiss Certificate of Chronometric Precision from the official watch rating center in Bienne, the first wristwatch in the world to earn such a certification. Think about that. A wristwatch. Not a pocket watch. A wristwatch. Then, in 1914, the Kew Observatory in England awarded Rolex a Class A Precision Certificate, an honor previously reserved only for marine chronometers, the gold standard of timekeeping. Now people were taking Rolex seriously, but life wasn't about to make it easy for Hans. World War I broke out that same year. Trade routes collapsed, economies trembled, anti-German sentiment in England surged. And here was Hans Wilsdorf, a German, selling Swiss watches in the heart of London. He knew he had to make a bold move. To protect his business, Hans relocated Rolex's headquarters from London to Geneva, Switzerland, a neutral country, a haven for watchmaking. A smart move that saved Rolex from economic disaster and political backlash. But the war brought something else. Opportunity. Soldiers hated pocket watches. Imagine being in the trenches, fumbling for a chain while bullets fly overhead. Wristwatches suddenly became a battlefield necessity. They were quicker, safer, and easier to use. Rolex capitalized on this shift. Hans doubled down on making wristwatches more robust, more durable, more accurate. He wasn't just selling watches anymore. He was redefining masculinity itself. He turned the wristwatch from a woman's accessory into a soldier's tool, into a man's machine. And it worked. By the early 1920s, Rolex wasn't just a company, it was a movement. But Hans wasn't done. He knew that precision wasn't enough. A wristwatch needed to be more than accurate. It needed to be resilient. One of the biggest challenges for watches at the time was environmental damage. Moisture, dust, and sweat could easily seep into the movement and wreak havoc. One tiny droplet could corrode gears, throw off timing, destroy the mechanism, and people wanted to wear their watches everywhere, while driving, while working, while traveling. So Hans threw down a challenge to his engineers: create a waterproof case, one that could completely protect the delicate inner movement from the outside world. It took years, trial after trial, prototype after prototype, until finally in 1926 Rolex unveiled the Rolex Oyster, the world's first waterproof wristwatch. It was a masterpiece, a hermetically sealed case, a patented screw-down crown, a fluted bezel. The design locked everything in. Nothing got in, not water, not dust, not heat. Hans knew he had something revolutionary. But how do you prove to the world that a watch is waterproof? Simple. You throw it into the sea. Enter Mercedes Gleitze. She was a young British swimmer attempting to cross the English Channel, a 21-mile swim through freezing waters between England and France. Hans contacted her and made a bold request: wear a Rolex Oyster around your neck while you swim. She agreed. She swam for over 10 hours in near-freezing temperatures. The swim had to be cut short due to exhaustion. But the Rolex? It came out of the water in perfect condition. Not a drop of water inside, still ticking. Hans pounced on the moment. He took out full-page ads in newspapers, put oysters in fish tanks in jewelry store windows. Let people walk by and stare at the watches. Fully submerged, still ticking. It was genius. It was aggressive. It was unforgettable. Rolex became a symbol of endurance, of trust, of perfection. Then came the next leap. Accuracy, achieved. Waterproofing, conquered. But there was one more frontier: convenience. Manual winding was still a chore. Every few days, you had to unscrew the crown, wind your watch, screw it back in. It was tedious. And for a waterproof watch, it was risky. Every time you opened the crown, you invited moisture. So Rolex built the first ever self-winding mechanism using a rotor that moved with your wrist's motion. In 1931, Rolex released the Oyster Perpetual, the first waterproof self-winding wristwatch in the world. No winding, no opening, just wear it, and it keeps ticking. It was elegant, effortless, eternal. And once again, Rolex had changed the game. But it wasn't just the tech that made Rolex legendary. It was Hans's obsession with storytelling. He knew that a great product wasn't enough. You had to make people feel something. So he linked Rolex to explorers, adventurers, record breakers. In 1933, Rolex watches accompanied the first flight over Mount Everest. In 1935, race car legend Sir Malcolm Campbell broke the land speed record, going over 300 miles per hour, wearing a Rolex. The message was clear. If a Rolex can survive Everest and 300 miles per hour, imagine what it can do on your wrist. People believed it. They bought it. They lived it. Rolex wasn't just a timepiece anymore. It was a passport to greatness. But greatness comes at a cost. War returned. World War II plunged Europe into darkness once again. Trade routes closed. Materials became scarce. Rolex's operations were disrupted. Worse, Hans Wilsdorf's beloved wife Florence passed away in 1944. The love of his life. Gone. It shattered him. But instead of retreating, Hans turned pain into purpose. He created the Wilsdorf Foundation, a charitable trust that would eventually inherit Rolex. He made one of the boldest decisions in business history. He transferred 100% ownership of Rolex to the foundation. No shareholders, no public listing, no profit-hungry board. Just a promise: Rolex would never be sold, never go public, and never forget its purpose. Hans Wilsdorf turned Rolex into a legacy, not just a company. And as the war ended, the world was finally ready to see just how powerful that legacy could become. Legacy beyond time. When the dust of war settled in Europe, most companies emerged battered, uncertain, or simply extinct. But Rolex? Rolex came out like a phoenix. Scarred, yes, but more iconic than ever. And Hans Wilsdorf, he was no longer just a watchmaker. He had become something else, a legend, a symbol of craftsmanship, resilience, and vision. But even he didn't know just how far his brand would soar after the war, because the true luxury of Rolex wasn't just in gold or steel, it was in its legacy. The year was 1945. The world had barely begun rebuilding. Economies were fragile, but Hans wasn't interested in waiting. He was a man who believed in progress. And in that same year, Rolex introduced a watch that redefined everyday functionality, the Rolex Datejust. It was the first self-winding chronometer wristwatch to display the date automatically. No need to track calendars, no need to think. The dial told you everything, simple, elegant, smart. But it was more than a date function. The Datejust became a symbol of precision married to innovation. It looked regal. It felt modern. It was versatile enough for businessmen, yet luxurious enough for aristocrats. And it was released on Rolex's 40th anniversary, a watchmaker's equivalent of fireworks. Then came 1953. This year changed everything, because that's when Rolex dropped a bombshell that would define their reputation among explorers and adrenaline junkies forever, the Rolex Submariner. This wasn't just a dive watch, it was the dive watch. The Submariner could withstand 100 meters of water pressure. In the early 1950s, that was unheard of. Divers had instruments, but watches? Number watches were supposed to stay on dry land. But the Submariner broke that rule, willingly, violently, beautifully. Hans Wilsdorf wanted Rolex to live underwater. He wanted it to go where most humans didn't. Because if a watch could survive the ocean, what couldn't it survive? The Submariner quickly gained legendary status, not just with divers, but with anyone who respected function-driven design. It had a rotating bezel to measure dive time. It glowed in the dark, it looked fierce, and it marked the moment when Rolex became not just a luxury item, but a tool. And tools don't follow fashion, they define purpose. That same decade, Rolex unleashed an onslaught of iconic models. The Explorer, released in 1953 after the successful ascent of Mount Everest. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay wore Rolex watches during their legendary climb. Rolex capitalized immediately, crafting the Explorer in their honor. It wasn't about looks, it was about survival at altitude. The GMT Master, launched in 1955 for Pan Am pilots flying intercontinental routes. It could display 2 time zones at once. Why? Because pilots needed to keep track of both home and destination times. It became the ultimate pilot's watch, a badge of prestige among airline captains. The Day Date dropped in 1956, the first wristwatch to display both the date and the day of the week in full. It was a calendar and a timepiece in one, worn by presidents, CEOs, world leaders. The Day Date wasn't just a watch, it was a statement. It earned the nickname the President's Watch. By this point, Rolex wasn't just innovating, it was dominating. No gimmicks, no wild marketing stunts, just relentless, meaningful progress. And behind all of it, Hans Wilsdorf, still pushing, still dreaming. But time, ironically, catches up to even the greatest of timekeepers. 1960, Hans Wilsdorf passed away at the age of 79. He died a widower, childless, and without a single share in the company he built. And yet, his legacy was bigger than any empire, because years earlier he had made the ultimate move of long-term vision. He handed complete ownership of Rolex to the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. No heirs, no corporate takeover, no quarterly earnings pressure. That one decision preserved Rolex in a time capsule of integrity. To this day, Rolex is owned by the Foundation, a private entity that reinvests profits into watchmaking research and charitable endeavors. It doesn't pay dividends to stockholders. It doesn't answer to Wall Street. It answers to its purpose. That's why Rolex has never sold out. No wild collaborations, no cheap limited editions, no licensing frenzy, just mastery. Timeless, unshakable mastery. But Rolex didn't stop innovating after Wilsdorf's death. In fact, the company arguably tightened its grip on excellence. In 1967, Rolex released the Sea Dweller, a deeper diving evolution of the Submariner. This beast could withstand 610 meters of water pressure and featured a helium escape valve to withstand saturation diving. It wasn't just designed for divers, it was built for professional aquanauts. Then came the Cosmograph Daytona, one of the most sought-after chronographs in history. Though it launched in 1963, it took decades to explode in popularity, mostly after actor Paul Newman was spotted wearing one. Today, vintage Daytonas fetch prices that rival sports cars. And that's the thing, Rolex doesn't follow trends. But trends follow Rolex. The company has remained ruthlessly consistent. Their core designs have changed very little in decades. Because they didn't need to. Why mess with perfection? Rolex watches aren't toys. They're not flamboyant. They're not screaming for attention. They're whispers of power, seen more than heard. Understated, yet immediately recognizable. You don't just own a Rolex. You carry it, like a quiet crown on your wrist. But there's another side of Rolex that's rarely discussed. The materials. In 1985, Rolex began using a metal that shocked the watch industry, 904L stainless steel. Now, 316L was the standard for luxury watches. Everyone used it. It was good, reliable, but Rolex wanted better. 904L was more corrosion-resistant, more durable, and shinier when polished. The downside: it was extremely difficult to machine. It wore down tools quickly. It required more sophisticated manufacturing. Most companies passed. Rolex didn't. They redesigned their entire production line to work with 904L. Why? Because they could. Because they weren't answering to a board begging for short-term profits. Because excellence, not ease, was the mission. That's why a Rolex doesn't just look different. It feels different. The weight, the sheen, the touch. It's like holding a piece of industrial poetry. By the 1990s and 2000s, Rolex had officially transcended watchmaking. It had become a cultural icon. James Bond wore it. So did Martin Luther King Jr., Fidel Castro, and Winston Churchill. It was on the wrists of tennis champions, deep-sea explorers, astronauts, and billionaires. And yet, through it all, it remained the same. The same principles Hans built it on: durability, elegance, performance. Even their movements stayed in-house. Rolex eventually brought almost every part of its production under its own roof. Dials, cases, bracelets, movements, everything was built by Rolex for Rolex. It's the only watch brand that controls nearly 100% of its supply chain. That's not just control, that's obsession. Hans would have been proud. And here's what truly separates Rolex from every other luxury brand: scarcity. Rolex doesn't mass produce. In fact, they're infamous for limiting supply. That's why certain models have waiting lists stretching years. Why some collectors treat a steel Daytona like treasure. Why the resale market is almost as expensive as the retail market. Rolex doesn't need to advertise. Demand outpaces supply on purpose. Scarcity creates mystique. Mystique creates obsession. Obsession creates legacy. And legacy? That's what Hans Wilsdorf was building all along. So where is Rolex today? Still in Geneva. Still owned by the Wilsdorf Foundation. Still private. Still powerful. They produce over 800,000 watches a year. But you'll never see a Rolex begging for your attention. There are no grand discounts, no seasonal sales, no Fashion Week collaborations, because Rolex doesn't chase consumers. It attracts disciples. And what started with an orphan boy in Germany has now become a $10 billion a year juggernaut, a name that represents excellence, consistency, and timeless class. Hans Wilsdorf didn't just build a watch, he built a religion, a quiet one, with no sermons, just steel, gold, platinum, and time. When you wear a Rolex, you're not wearing jewelry. You're wearing a philosophy, a reminder that greatness isn't rushed, that detail matters, that perfection is a journey, not a gimmick. From winding watches in a Swiss office to revolutionizing an entire industry, Hans Wilsdorf proved one thing: you don't need a crown to build an empire. You just need vision and time.